Okay, welcome back. We were talking about the establishment of the Jim Crow laws there in the last lesson. We're going to look now at this from Civil War to the Great War, a period called in the South Reconstruction. After the Civil War, the South was beaten and occupied by the Union troops from the North. And there was, of course, it was a surly sort of submission. They didn't really accept their position of being subjected to the North. It took some time. And of course, the Union presidents and the Union leaders of the United States, now the Union, I'm talking about the North, they didn't trust the South to re-establish the state parliaments for about 10 years or so. And then, of course, the period called Reconstruction ended, and the system began to return. So lots and lots of black voters started to register and get involved in politics, and pretty soon the white establishment in the South began to devise systems where that they would be able to keep the blacks out of politics, like I was talking about. Okay. Also, this coincides with the United States emerging as a great world power between 1865 to 1919. Look at the date, 1919. End of the First World War. This was the United States' first real involvement in Europe, and they played a big part in the defeat of Germany in 1918. They got involved in the war, of course, famously because of the British were lobbying them to get involved because of unrestricted submarine warfare was the short-term cause. And the United States entered the war, sent about 1 million troops to Europe, and was decisive in stopping, first of all, the German breakthrough of 1918, and then subsequently played a part in Germany being pushed back into Belgium, where the war, of course, was an armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918. The President of the United States at the time, a Southerner, who introduced segregation into the White House, Woodrow Wilson, went to Europe and negotiated the Treaty of Versailles and the subsequent Paris Peace Agreement. And that was interesting because when he came back to America, he got voted out, he lost the election. He thought he was the big man in Europe, but he came back to America, and Americans said, well, we don't really want to have anything to do with Europe. We're not really that interested in Europe. Of course, a lot of people had left Europe, left it behind, and what they call the old world. And now they were in the new world. They left, so they got rid of Wilson, and of course Wilson then never ratified the Treaty of Versailles in America. As a result, this was a huge benefit to Adolf Hitler in the 1930s because the United States, guarantor of the peace treaty, but not guarantor of the peace treaty, not really willing to get involved. So, that's a little bit of a digression, pardon me. Europe left to develop its considerable industrial resources on its own. It was an industrial powerhouse, a large population, no hostile neighbours, lots of raw materials. That's what you need to become a world power. And it was the largest economy in the world. It's remained the largest economy in the world since 1914. It's been the largest economy in the world, despite some hiccups along the way, like the Great Depression, 1929, okay, which lasted about. The real immediate bad effects lasted about 4 years, but the big effects lasted about 10 years. And of course we had the economic meltdown of 2008, the world recession there. Okay, but let's get back to what we should be talking about. The largest economy in the world. Slavery was abolished in the South. The white gentry maintained control. That's what we were talking about, isn't it? They managed to do it through segregation, intimidation, and discrimination. Okay, I'm going to explain that to you now. First of all, the southern black community faced discrimination in terms of voting and housing. And this is linked, housing and voting, especially in terms of local government and state government. State governments began to introduce various taxes or various qualifications for voting. This is seen as what's called electoral management today. So, for example, to give you a parallel, when you're studying Northern Ireland, we will talk about the local elections for Catholics in Northern Ireland. You had to own a house to get a vote in the local elections. In other words, you had to be a ratepayer. that's what it was called, to get a vote in the local elections. And as a result, Catholics weren't allocated public housing because they would have a vote, and if they had a vote, it might upset the Protestant dominance in towns and cities like Derry. Okay. Similar things happened in the south. To disenfranchise, that's what it's called, is to remove people's vote. So, for example, they might introduce a poll tax in certain states, and a poll tax meant that you had to pay a certain amount of tax in order to qualify for voting. And of course, the white community, being richer, could afford to pay this tax. The black community, being poorer, couldn't pay the tax. As a result, they controlled the voting system. Simple enough. Another voting system that they introduced was a thing called the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause said, if you want to vote, it has to be that your grandfather always voted too. Now, of course, if they introduced this in 1880, every black person's grandfather was a slave. So they weren't entitled to vote as well. And under the federal system, states could do this. There was all sorts of systems like that. Some of them were blatantly and obviously unfair. Others were a little bit more subtle. But they all produced the same result, discrimination. One of the most notorious ones was called the 8-box ballot law. Okay, so you've got your vote here in your hand. You go in and there's 8 boxes in front of you. You've got your vote, you have to guess which box is the correct one for your vote to count. Okay, so you put it in this box, and you don't know, of course, if you were brave enough to turn up to vote at all, if you're black, or even to register for voting. If you were registered to vote, you have to register to vote, as you know. So, put it in the box there. Of course, and that's how people were discriminated against. We also think intimidation. When black people did register to vote or tried to get involved in public life, in other words, become political representatives, they often faced intimidation. Their house might be burnt out. They might be beaten. The worst thing that could happen is they could be lynched. Lynching became a custom in the South in the 1880s, the 1890s. Lynching is accusing somebody of a crime. This is what the word means. Lynching is accusing somebody of a crime, and the community deals with them, or a group deals with them without going to trial. So it's illegal, of course. And in the South, lynching remained as part of Southern life right up until the 1940s, the outbreak of World War II. They estimate there was over 4,000 lynchings in the South. There was one lynching in Texas where they recorded the screams of the victims and sold them on record, on what they called a gramophone thing. This is what you would call vinyl today, a vinyl record. Segregation became the third pillar of this what we call Jim Crow system, and segregation became legal in the year 1896 when there was a finding in the Supreme Court of America. And the Supreme Court had a case. The case was called Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, the Supreme Court, the judges of America, the Supreme Court is made up of 9 judges. The 9 met and decided that segregation of the races was legal within the United States. In other words, then, it became part of what we know as the Constitution. Segregation was legal on the principle of separate but equal. That was the phrase, separate but equal. And then we have the colour line established in the South. All the southern states began to discriminate in terms of public facilities, education, all of that sort of area. So if you went to the South in the 1960s, before 1964, there was a black area of a restaurant and a white area of a restaurant. Okay, there was, and it's for coloured only, or for white only. black swimming pools, white swimming pools, this total segregation of the system. Okay. So colour line was drawn. And of course, the facilities were not separate but equal, they were separate but unequal. So that's a Jim Crow system. Now, when we're studying this period, I've given you quite a bit of background there of the Jim Crow system. By the way, lastly, Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a cartoon character. He appears in newspapers, like a newspaper cartoon. He was a black, small boy, and he appears in these sort of what they called humour at that particular time. And there was a series called the Jim Crow series, and that's what they called the laws from. He wasn't an actual character, that's what they called the Jim Crow laws, the Jim Crow system. Okay, and it summed up this inherent racism within the United States. So the movement, which became known as the Civil Rights Movement, actually began well before the Second World War. But it was an attempt by black people in the southern states of the United States to achieve the same rights as other Americans. That's all what civil rights is. They wanted their constitutional rights, an end to segregation, and an end to discrimination, and of course, an end to this as well. So there are the three aims, really, of the system. Now I say that the movement really began in the early 20th century. In the north, blacks were free. They were free to vote. There was an emerging black middle class in the northern states and in the cities. And of course, you have the emergence of organisations. The most important organisation that begins to emerge at this time is the NAACP. You're going to need to know about this. National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, NAACP, one of the most important civil rights groups, advocacy groups in the United States. The aim of the NAACP, they're a legal organisation. They want to challenge, when they get the chance, any of these issues in courts. Their ultimate aim and their strategy after 1948, 1950, around that time, their strategy becomes to try to get cases, test cases, to the Supreme Court. Because a finding of the Supreme Court, under the system of the separation of powers in the United States, under the American Constitution, Supreme Court law applies to the whole land. Okay? So this is one way of amending and changing the Constitution. And so that's what the NAACP's strategy was, you see. And that's really what the strategy is around the Montgomery bus boycott, to take it into the courts and try and get a federal ruling on that. Okay? If there were so many federal rulings, the government would eventually legislate and introduce a Civil Rights Act, which they did, of course, in 1964. Okay, so that's what the strategy is, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. We're going to fast forward then to the year 1945, at the end of the First World War, the 20s and the 30s. 20s and 30s were such grim times if you were from the South. They began a thing called the Great Migration. The Great Migration, and the Great Migration was people who left the system in the South and they went to the North. they often had to sneak away because in the South they'd set up a system, an economic system called sharecropping. You might wonder what when the slaves were freed, what they did for a livelihood, what they did for money. Because now they were free people, but they had to earn their own money. They had to earn their own money and they had to get their own places to live, buy their own food, all that sort of stuff. A system developed in the South called sharecropping, which existed for about maybe the next 100 years or so. Often the former slaves went back to work for their former masters, but they had to enter into terms of employment and negotiation of employment with their former masters. The systems that they developed were called sharecropping. Sharecropping kept the black people in the South poor. It was based around cotton and tobacco, and they gave people a share of the crop. So you became a sort of a kind of a junior partner in the cotton farm, right? And you, as a result, you got a share of the crop every year. But the share of the crop was never enough to give you any sort of economic independence. And so people were in a permanent debt to the landowner or the gentry person, and this of course was a system which went along with intimidation and Ku Klux Klan, the voting system and the Jim Crow system, sharecropping. So lots of people began to leave. They began to leave the South at a time known as the Great Migration in the 1920s and 1930s. They left the South and they had to leave the South at night because they owed quite a lot of money, or they owed quite a lot under the system of sharecropping. It might be quite a lot, but they still owed and they didn't have the means to pay. So often they had to slip off from where they lived, the farm, at night and make their way north. And they were making their way north to the city of Detroit, to the cities of Chicago, and to the cities of New York and Boston and places like that. Okay, and in these big cities, they faced discrimination, but there was jobs, and there was jobs in the emerging car industry. Detroit was known as the Motor City, and so we have sizable urban black communities beginning to emerge in the 20s and 30s. Okay, when World War II comes, we have the colour line still in the South. When the troops enlist for World War II, the units are segregated. They're segregated along colour lines. So you have your black unit, your white unit, and there's no mixing within the army as such. Okay. And then of course we get to 1945, and we've met this man before, President Truman. He got the job in a way by default because Roosevelt died in office in April 1945. Roosevelt was a sort of an icon within America. He brought America from the midst of depression to the verge of victory in World War II. And then Truman, of course, came along and he became President of the United States. And he oversaw the American victory in World War II. In Europe, a great victory it was too. And in Japan, controversially, by the dropping of 2 atomic bombs, the new superweapon. And of course, they were the only 2 atomic bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So he emerged as a president, and he's going to be president from 1945 to 1953. He's under a bit of pressure in 1945. Initially he's got what they call the honeymoon period, where he's in power and he's not under that much pressure, but then as time grows and as the Soviet threat begins to build, what they perceived as a Soviet threat within the United States, Truman is under lots of pressure from the media, the print media and the broadcast media, in order to try and get tough on communists. We see this when we looked at the Red Scare, how Truman was susceptible to talking about people as communists and things like that. And of course, he faced other challenges. He faced a big challenge in terms of the post-war American economy. Now, the post-war American economy, this had gone very, very badly at the end of World War I, where you had a lot of returning troops without jobs and prospects. So Truman introduced lots of government stimuluses in the economy, such as the GI Bill, such as free credit and all this sort of cheap credit, I should say. A big housing building program, to offer the Americans returning from the war all these benefits, and so not to have a period of post-war deflation and instability. Also you have in this time, this is called the baby boom period, from this post-war baby boom, and this generation became known in America, I think the phrase is still used today, boomers, okay, born between 1945 and say 1960. Where there was a bit of a population growth. So Truman oversaw all this in America, of course, miles ahead of the rest of the world. World War II made America very rich. They produced 50% of the world's goods. And so here we have Truman presiding over this great economic period, okay? And also presiding over a system of segregation in the southern states of the United States, which in this new modern world seemed ridiculously old-fashioned. He became President of the United States after the death of Roosevelt. He won the subsequent election in '48 and remained in office until '52 when he was gone, and he was replaced by his old wartime commander, Eisenhower of the Republicans. Republicans had been out of office for 20 years. He was a Democrat, and he's remembered mostly for the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan in 1945. He successfully managed the American economy after the war, and of course, with the beginnings of the Cold War, which you all know about, okay? Truman Doctrine, Marshall Aid, transforming Europe, transforming Western Europe. But 5 years after the end of World War II, America was at war again in the Korean War, 1950 to 53. Amazing, really, just 5 years. And of course, in 1948 came this, the desegregation of the armed forces. This was a big moment. It was a government initiative. Black troops fought well and shown themselves to be loyal to the United States in World War II. They came home and they carried on a campaign called the Double V campaign. Churchill used to go around doing this all the time. V. He actually did it like this, but we shouldn't be doing that. So it was like this. V. Victory in Europe. Okay? The Double V campaign, victory in Europe and victory over the racists back home. Victory over segregation. And this led to desegregation of the armed forces. But it wasn't to do with that, really. It was the American army looking and saying, well, look, we've got a whole load of people here, and they can join the army. So the army became desegregated in 1948. It was a big opportunity for black people to join the army into an institution, and of course, bullets don't have a colour line or anything like that. And of course, lots and lots of black people have used the army to gain and make themselves as a form of making a living for themselves, you see. So this is 1948. Now the Secretary of War at the time, Stimson, Henry Stimson, was an old-fashioned racist. He believed blacks were inferior. He believed they couldn't fight in cold weather. All these sort of negative stereotypes, and he was against it. Yet the potential of this group to join the army generals wanted it. They wanted it to happen, and of course now we have great progress for black people within the armed forces, into generals, into the top of the army, all that sort of thing. Okay, so this is interesting. Okay, and it adds to the sort of situation. So you're dealing with Truman. You need to know his dates, and you need to know this man's dates as well. Eisenhower, known as Ike, I-K-E, yes, that's what he was called. And there he is now. He's not a very good golfer, by the way. Eisenhower, all the American presidents are meant to be very good golfers. Even Trump is supposed to be a very good golfer. Although they say that Trump, in order to get his handicap down, or to get these course records, he builds a golf course and he plays on his own, so he holds the record for the course. That's what they say. Dwight D. Eisenhower, he'd been the Allied commander in Europe, vastly experienced. What a job that was, what a big pressurised job what that was. He oversaw Operation Overlord, D-Day, the invasion of Western Europe, and he was joint commander of the American and the British forces. So it shows that the Americans were playing the senior role in that particular arrangement, the British and the Americans. And of course, he oversaw the defeat of the Nazis in Western Europe, vastly experienced man, and of course, both sides wanted him as a candidate. And he became a Republican, and he was a Republican president from 1953 up until Kennedy gets the job, wins the election in 1960. All right. During his presidency, he oversees some landmark decisions in civil rights. Eisenhower. First of all, in 1954, segregation in education went in front of our friends, the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court at this stage, the 9 of them, when the law went up, and I'll explain in more detail when we get to it, the 9 in the Supreme Court voted 9-0 to get rid of segregation in education. They called it segregation in education. They said it was inherently unequal. So they were overturning a part of the Plessy versus Ferguson legislation from 1896, and that's the segregation in education, 1954. Really, really big decision, of course, and it says the implications of that are that if the NAACP can bring further cases to the Supreme Court, they know how the Supreme Court is going to vote, and so this now becomes the big focus of the 1950s. In between this and this, we have the Montgomery bus boycott, famous. The Montgomery bus boycott ends up in the Supreme Court of the United States in 1956, and it's about segregation in transport, in public transport. Not interstate transport, but public transport. And of course, the Supreme Court votes 9-0 in favour of this. And then we have the attempt to implement it. It's okay to change the law, but to implement a change the law is a big thing. And we have what we call the Little Rock 9 in Arkansas, in the Deep South. 9 black school children line up to attend a white school under this law. And this is a big test for Eisenhower, to see if he uphold the law of the land, because the governor is saying no, they can't attend, the school is saying no, they can't attend, they're facing all sorts of hostility. He sent federal troops to make sure that the girl and the 9, they weren't all girls, sorry, the leading girl, Elizabeth Eckford, we show you a photograph of her later on, they could attend the school, and there would be federal guards out there in the corridors making sure that the law was implemented. So Eisenhower, when the test came, he was going to uphold the law of the land. So the idea is to change the law of the land. That's the strategy of the NAACP. That's what's happening. This is the beginnings of what we call direct action.